Welcome to episode 48 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hi there.
Hey, Andrew. As we tackle a different featured topic each episode, new ones are normally out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. Please do rate and review us and drop us a line anytime at podcast@firewalls.com. As always, thanks for listening, and now it's time to introduce our featured topic and our guests for this episode.
Cyber threats change every day, and that means security solutions need to keep up as well. With ransomware, remote access vulnerabilities, branch connectivity challenges, and more, businesses need solutions that cover a whole host of issues.
To talk about some of the biggest security and connectivity issues facing businesses today and how a new suite of products is designed to address them, we welcome Chen and Shane Davis, with a leader in next-gen cybersecurity, Sophos. Shane, thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So first of all, could each of you take a second and tell us a little bit about what it is you do with Sophos?
Yeah, so I'll go first. I'm Chen. I'm a Sophos sales engineer. So I've been with the company for 5 years, and then previously with another company, another cybersecurity company for a very long time. So we're here to support a lot of our, select partners, including, the IBNs and whatnot. So that's our job, to facilitate and help our resellers.
And I'm Shane Davis. Before Sophos, I had my own little solutions architect type company, I guess small business, where I'm originally from. I came on to Sophos to help support pretty much the same thing that Aaron does now. So we're both a team.
So as we sort of set the stage for this conversation, we know in the last couple of years, there have been some real world challenges that may have changed cybersecurity even a bit more than it had already been headed towards before. So how has cybersecurity sort of evolved and the needs evolved in just the past year or two?
Yeah, so to talk about the last couple of years, right, I'm sure COVID, that word's going to come up whenever we ask for anything over the last couple of years, right? So in the cybersecurity space, it's really no different. So the biggest thing here, as you would imagine, people working from home. So cybersecurity companies, network companies, they need to facilitate that type of remote access. And being in the cybersecurity space, not only we need to facilitate that, but we got to make sure that those secure remote access securing those remote access connections as well as the reliability. So that leads into a lot of conversations around, SD-WANs, remote VPNs, and things like that, right? So it really doesn't matter where people work, right? Business has to continue to work and flow and things like that. So what we're also seeing out there is the adversaries, right? The bad guys, the hackers, they didn't stop working either, right? So, we're seeing cybersecurity attacks. There was a lot of news-worthy type of discussions and hacks and things like that going on, right? Like the, SolarWinds, Hafnium, Colonial Pipeline, JBS, the meat processing company, they all been hit, right? They all been hit one time or another over the past, year or so, right? So, just because COVID in the US is getting better, I don't think any of that's going to stop, right? So it's really, from a customer or, from a user standpoint, right? The mentality is also changing as well. So, almost like assume that you will get hit. Right. It's just a matter of time. And there's a lot of studies that was done as well. Right. So of all the, I think it was a study, it was like a third of all customers out there already been attacked by ransomware, or at least experienced ransomware. Right. So that's what we've been seeing from a Sophos standpoint. Right. We're seeing a bit of a transition as well, going from just, the good old fashioned antivirus endpoint security product. We're seeing a lot of customers moving into managed security services as well, because they just don't feel safe enough, right? They don't get that peace of mind. So we have seen a huge uptick in managed security services.
And so you mentioned that it's almost a given that everybody's going to be attacked at this point. And a lot of smaller businesses, that wasn't always the case. 5-10 years ago, they weren't so worried about that. But now even SMBs are getting hit as frequently as enterprises. So what is your average small business out there looking to get out of a network security appliance? What are the key features in that side of the cybersecurity world?
Yeah, that's a good question. For small business, when they're looking at on the network side, right? Network security on the perimeter type of scenario, right? I mean, just like we talked about before, people working from home, I mean, a lot of times that perimeter is kind of disappearing in a way as well, right? But for the most part, you still need to facilitate that, just because users are not in the office, right? But they still need access to stuff in the office, whether the office is, physically located somewhere or virtually, right? So having that network security in place is very important. So when it comes to kind of the most two important things to look for, right? I think folks have already kind of have their mindset of, what the ACLs are, right? That's pretty given. But really, the most important thing I would think is for sure the ability to look inside those encrypted traffic, and namely being HTTPS websites, right? Because oftentimes, those are, overlooked, right? Either they feel that, secure websites are secure, which isn't, that's a secure website, what that means is encrypted, right? Doesn't mean that it's secure, right? So a lot of bad guys actually embed a lot of malicious content on those HTTPS websites, right? So definitely, have a firewall or a network appliance in place to be able to look, be the man in the middle, right? Inspect those traffic, on top of the regular traffic. Because, according to Google, 90% of all internet traffic out there are HTTPS traffic.
Yeah, you need that visibility. So are there some other factors that, in your dealings with small businesses and mid-sized businesses that maybe they're not really fully understanding? I mean, is encrypted traffic one of those things that maybe they didn't realize was such an issue?
Yeah, that definitely, right? Because when people see HTTPS, that S kind of, gives a false sense of security, right? Because all that really means is encrypting that traffic from the server to the browser, really, right? What if the server is compromised to deploy malware? And there is really no difference whether they're publishing that malware on a, HTTP website versus HTTPS website, right? So having that man in the middle is ultimately, very, very important. And the other factor in folks not inspecting HTTPS traffic, not that, the technology is not there, right? The technology is often there. Another reason they're shying away from doing that is also on performance, where, oftentimes when folks enable, TLS encryption or HTTPS decryption, right? It bogs down the firewall and really impacts performance where, things like voice over IP, streaming videos and things like that, right? Well, they'll start seeing, hiccups and things, right? So that's another reason why folks don't turn it on. And they really need to consider the next generations of firewalls that can handle all of this stuff.
So speaking of the next generation, I'm sure all of our Sophos fans out there are well familiar with EDR as part of your Intercept X advanced offerings. But now we're beginning to see this summer the mention of XDR, a new acronym for the security space. What is XDR and how does it build on EDR? What's the next step in that direction?
XDR is really, stands for extended DR, right? So everybody will know what EDR is, right? Endpoint DR, and this is extended discovery and response. So what that really means is more telemetry. So not only we're getting information, right, intelligence from endpoint, which is still the bulk of, of even XDR, right? But imagine having that endpoint feed on top of feeds from all the servers. Now you're also getting a network feed, knowing what's going in and out of your network, knowing emails that are coming in and going out. And on top of that, also, a possibility of providing third-party feeds as well, right? So with that, it kind of collect all this information. And not to be confused with the technology called a SIM, right? SIM does all this too, right? But that's where a SIM stops, right? It collects that data, but it doesn't really correlate it and provide intelligence for customers, right? So what XDR does is that it correlates that information and it actually parse that information into linking things like, for example, somebody got hit with ransomware, even though the product was able to detect and block the ransomware. But now with XDR, we also know that it was because somebody got a phishing email. The guy clicked on the link, went to some website, got hit because potentially it was a secure website. right? And the firewall is basically skipping that and not inspecting it until it got to the endpoint, right? So with XDR, it really helped paint a picture of the root cause of, where that malware originated from. And it really also helped develop patterns and, knowing how malware gets in and gives you a better idea of how to counter that.
So that's an area really leads into the idea of the network edge in a way, because if somebody brings that malware into the system through sort of side door, if you will, how has that really changed in terms of now also with the fact that you have all the remote connectivity happening? How has the network edge really changed, or the idea of it really changed?
Yeah, and it's really, there is really no perimeter. And over the past couple of years with the help of COVID, right, kind of really proved that. Right. So people can work anywhere. Right. So the perimeter is really anywhere, whether, you certainly need to protect the endpoint and where the intellectual property sits. Right. So intellectual properties could sit on the endpoint, or it could be on a server, could be on AWS, Azure, on-prem. It's really everywhere. There is really no edge anymore. Right. So that's why the idea of this XDR having a listener, a probe, right, the feedback from the endpoint, from the network, from email, all of that correlates to, to provide that central intelligence. And on top of that, I think people are sometimes overlooking it is the cloud, right? So since data is everywhere, there is no perimeter, right? So you got to really centralize it on the cloud, on a secure cloud that would be able to have this visibility all in one single location.
So I've written enough sort of cybersecurity 101 articles out there that I've used the old firewalls or like a gatekeeper or security guard comparison 1,000 times probably. But here we are saying that edge no longer really exists. So how have firewalls as a device kept up with that?
So firewalls, there is still absolutely a huge need for firewalls, right? Because everything is kind of scattered everywhere, right? So we have endpoint firewalls, we have gateway firewalls, we have branch, smaller firewalls, right? And they all can be meshed together as well. It's called, SD-WAN, centralized kind of VPN orchestration, right? To have that secure connection amongst all of that stuff, right? But from a firewall standpoint, you gotta, beef it up as well. So, not only people are now starting to, looking at TLS inspection, like we talked about earlier, the HTTPS, kind of opening up the packets, inspect it, put it back together, right? Really process intensive stuff. And at the same time, we got to facilitate the absolute business need things like VoIP, like video streaming, like Zooms and all that stuff, right? So definitely hardware is going to get, need to come up to speed as well to be able to, do all of this stuff.
Speaking of coming up to speed, we do have a new line of firewalls at Sophos, the XGS firewall series. So is that addressing a lot of those issues that we've just talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that XGS release or that hardware release, it really started about a year and a half ago. It's not that we knew COVID's coming, right? But it's just kind of happened to be, right? So last year we released a firmware version 18, right? That really had a, architectural change on the, on the way we handle and bucket and categorize the different traffic patterns, right? Putting them into what is a streaming type of protocol versus the ones that are, CPU intensive, like SSL decryption. So architecturally, we released it on version 18, and just by the software update, right, we were able to also improve the performance of existing hardware. Now, this year, we released the XGS hardware platform, and you can just think of that as, hardware acceleration, that already has taken place with the software. Now with the hardware in place, every single XGS model comes with two CPUs, two physical CPUs. So there is the, the CPU, right? The central processor unit that does all the number crunching, right? And the other one is an MPU, what marketing calls it, extreme processor, that is dedicated to handle all the streaming type of media. So no longer the customer have to worry about, if I do this, will it impact my VoIP, right? Will it impact, the Zoom experience and whatnot, right? So with the two CPU architecture, it really solves those problems.
So this Xstream processor is taking all of that live streaming data and sort of segmenting it off into its own area at this point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yep.
So how did these new XGS firewalls and the XDR fit together? How do these integrate into one solution?
So yeah, they, obviously Sophos being, Sophos XGS being a gateway, right? So by nature, by default, right? It also feeds into this XDR capability, of Sophos. But Sophos, that technology, what we call, synchronized security or their security heartbeat, right? It's always in play where every single Sophos product by default talks to one another. If the firewall sees an endpoint, right, behaving maliciously where it is, looking like it's compromised and whatnot, it actually alerts the endpoint, right? It triggers a scan. It can also isolate that endpoint. That's already in place for a long time now, right? So with the XDR capability, we just integrate and correlate a lot more information between, the firewall and the endpoint. So right from the Sophos Central Management Console, right, it has full visibility into what all products that Sophos customers have, right? Whether it's the XGS firewall, even the older XG firewall, right? Email, endpoint can all be, visible directly from one console. And there are also scheduled queries as well, right? So that with one single query, it will look across multiple different products and come back with, with basically one result, right? So you don't have to do multiple queries, look in different places, different consoles. It all consolidates everything into one.
And does that even extend beyond our, non-existent perimeter at this point?
Yeah, there is really, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because, as long as they have internet access, even for like agents, right? What we call on the endpoint side, the software, even if some of the machines, we have seen it in customer environments, some are air gap machines where they don't have internet access. We also resolve that problem with message relay too, so that they can relay that connection, right? So if they want to lock down certain machines and no internet access, not a problem. We can relay that information. So yeah, so even though that customers put in perimeters, additional layer of security, that's great. So, we can relay that information back and still they all be managed under the same cloud console.
So you mentioned that people who have maybe the legacy XG firewall have gotten some of these features already. When does that go into the calculus go together with the idea of this is the right time to upgrade, whether it's a XG device, an SG device, or a different manufacturer?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So it's really to a point where customer feel like they need to improve, right? So the firewall is not end all be all, but certainly, when they seeing performance hits, when they realize that I am not inspecting SSL traffic, maybe I should, because that is one of the gaps that need to sealed up, right? And if they own an older firewall, especially like an SG firewall or like some Sonic Wall boxes or whatever they are, right? Some older boxes, right? Is a definitely consider upgrading, and not only looking at from a firewall perspective, right? Can I also view what's going on the endpoint as well, right? To kind of correlate that, right? It's going back to what we talked about earlier, you kind of have to assume that eventually, the bad guy is going to come around and get to you. Assume that you will eventually get hit, whether or not it's a successful hit or not, right? So it's really up to you to whether you not, they want to take some action now, or, would it be okay to, to take a small risk and then wait a little longer?
The philosophy that you mentioned, I think, is really interesting, and it's something that we've talked about a lot recently. The assumption of getting hit and being prepared for it in that way, instead of the old batten down the hatches and stop any possible situation from happening in the first place. It's really that's just not realistic anymore.
That's right. Yeah, you got to prepare for the incident response, right? Compared to like real life. Even though that everybody's healthy, the house is not on fire, right? And things like that. You got to have those, things in place. What if things happen, how do I minimize the damage? How do I minimize the risk? And if I do get hit, right? If the house is on fire, what number should I call, right? You got to have those things in place.
So if we've piqued the interest of some viewers out there and they kind of want to explore this technology and what can do for them, would they be able to demo it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sophos products are very demo friendly. So definitely reach out anytime. We will be able to demo, and even professional services or managed security services, right? You really can't really demo managed security services, but we can certainly show you, and kind of walk you through what the kind of like a day in life of a security analysts, what they do, what can they cover, what their jobs are, and how do they work with customers, almost like a demo, really, to give you a good sense of what their lives are.
So if someone's interested, where should people go to learn a little bit more about these?
So definitely, they can reach out to you guys, right? And they'll loop us in. Obviously, there is Sophos.com as well, which is our public landing webpage that has a great deal of information. But for the most part, reach out to you guys and loop us in. We'll be happy to talk to any customer.
All right. Anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think this is great discussion, and I really welcome this. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks very much for joining us. Now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we take a closer look at some top stories in the cybersecurity world and discuss what they may mean to you. Now, headline number 1. Biden sets red line for Putin over ransomware attacks, and we're going to make this a two-part number 1. Senators draft bill that would require many entities to report cyber breaches within 24 hours. So the two parts together means really it sort of ties in with the federal government responding to some cybersecurity issues of the day. We've talked about both of these in some detail over the last several episodes. So let's start first with the president. So President Biden delivered a stern warning to Russian leader Vladimir Putin over ransomware attacks emanating from Russia, saying he was prepared to retaliate against any more cyber assaults on American infrastructure. So the retaliation piece is what we've been talking about.
Yeah, these stories are always fun because, at the end of the day, it's just a furrowed brow, and he probably said one line or two about it. But, you have to give the media something when it comes to being tough on this kind of thing. So, yes, Biden gave Putin a red line, which included a number of different industries and infrastructure pieces that are off limits for hacking, which concerns me that there are some things that are on limits.
Just focus your energy on these instead.
Baby steps.
Yeah, after the two leaders had a summit in Geneva, Biden said that he laid down that line because the Russian hackers have extorted millions, hundreds of millions even, from companies, organizations, and governments around the world. The administration is not taking the extra step of saying that they are working with the Russian government or state-sponsored in any way, but the administration is saying that they are being enabled and protected, basically, by Russia.
Right, so these are not state-sponsored Russian hacking groups. These are Russian hacking groups that happen to be in the state of Russia. So there's a bit of a blurry line there. And Biden issued a warning saying that America has its own significant cyber capabilities and would use them if needed. So we're not quite sure what the specific capabilities he's referencing were because our official, agencies in charge of that thing is not going to share that info with us.
Yeah, and President Biden even had a kind of funny quote for the thread. In terms of Putin, he says, quote, "He doesn't know exactly what it is, but it's significant. If in fact they violate these basic norms, we will respond." So
can't get more specific than that.
Not really, no.
And for Putin's part, he denied everything, of course, saying that all of these ideas of Russian hackers are just blown out of the water, and in fact it is America who is doing most of the cyber crime. So a little bit of finger pointing and not a whole lot of substance here.
No, he did acknowledge that the issue of cybersecurity and cybercrime was, quote, extremely important, and he said the two sides agreed to hold formal consultations on it. He said, "We need to drop all insinuations, sit down at an expert level, and start working in the interests of the U.S. and Russia." So there may be more conversations to come here. Probably not quite as blustery unless they're in front of some cameras.
Right.
We already kind of know the history here, quite a bit of the ransomware activity out there, including the ransomware as a service activity that we've been seeing a lot of lately, is been based out of Russian borders, or, we've talked about the targets that have any kind of Russian language involved being excluded. So there's definitely something to do with Russia on these many ransomware cells that are out there. Assistant Attorney General John Demers does say, again, that this is not being conducted by Russian government officials, officials, but is being tolerated. And a step further, not just tolerated, he said they're actively getting in the way of U.S. law enforcement efforts to combat this type of hacking. So 16 areas of crucial infrastructure were deemed off limits by President Biden, including energy and water. So, yeah, we don't know what all of them are, and we don't know what the ones that are not on the list are either. But,
right. If you didn't make that list, I'm sorry, but you've been sacrificed.
Yeah.
But the official posturing has begun, if that means anything for the future.
Yes. So, part 2 of this headline number 1 involves the United States Senate. And we talked a few episodes back about the fact that there are a number of states that have gotten on the cyber policy train a little bit. But the federal government, while they've had a few senators sort of championing some type of action, has not taken any sort of comprehensive cybersecurity action in terms of legislation. And so that might be changing as U.S. lawmakers are prepping legislation, according to CNN, that would require a vast range of public and private entities to alert the government within 24 hours of a cybersecurity breach. And that's coming from Senators Mark Warner, Virginia Democrat, Marco Rubio, Florida Republican, and Susan Collins, a Maine Republican. All three of these names have been associated with some other cyber stories that we've talked about in the past.
Right. So at first glance, seems like a strange bag, but it all makes sense in this particular subject. So this is all happening in Congress. There is currently no single federal standard. There is, however, a somewhat new standard that was released for the Transportation Security Administration in response to the U.S. pipeline hack. So in that new requirement would be that any U.S. pipeline company attacked would have to notify the U.S. government within 12 hours. This current discussion, as you said, is focusing on a 24-hour notification period.
Yeah, which wouldn't give the pipelines more time because the TSA rule would supersede that. But yeah, the bill in Washington would apply to government agencies, federal contractors, and critical infrastructure owners and operators, such as businesses in the manufacturing, energy, and financial services sectors. But we don't have to worry about them because they're
behind a red line. Yes. So the idea here is to try to basically share as much visibility and intel as possible with the U.S. government between all these different industries so that we can sort of develop a united front and strategy to start working against these hackers and these attacks. So basically, the more info you can share, the quicker everybody knows about it, the more quickly and cohesively they can respond.
Yeah, basically, the government doesn't want secret breaches happening in the U.S. The government wants to be aware anytime something happens to any of these types of companies or organizations, and the incentive to reporting is the inclusion in this bill of liability protection, which is another piece that we've talked about before. So basically, if companies submit breach notification reports, that means the U.S. government would protect them in some way financially, I would assume, from liability for making that report, maybe due to reputational damage that they otherwise might have been able to sweep under the rug. Who knows?
Right, and just to be clear, this is 24 hours within discovering the breach. We tend to know from these stories that the breach actually occurred months ahead of the company's discovery.
Or years.
Or years. So that is a bit of a sticking point. They can't really notify the government until they've found out for themselves, which in most cases is too late. But Eric Goldstein, Executive Assistant Director for the Cybersecurity at at DHS, claims that this is necessary because they need the ability to get visibility into national security risks.
Yes, he says they need to understand where adversaries are intruding into networks across the country, understand the techniques that they're using to break in, what they're doing or trying to do, and the more of that kind of information we get, we can then protect others. So the draft bill, I should say, also directs the Department of Homeland Security to develop additional rules with definitions and requirements associated with implementing the law, and for DHS and CISA to submit annual reports to Congress about the notifications. So that'll be some more podcast fodder if we get an annual report where we can really just go through that and dig through the list of all the breaches.
I'm sure that'll be a very long list.
We hear about a lot of them now, but it will also be interesting to see if this does get passed, first of all, and signed into law, what the mechanism is for this, and would we find out at the end of the year, for instance, about a bunch that maybe didn't make the news but were still reported. You would think that once the reporting takes place, it might find its way out into the public domain somehow.
Right.
Now, headline number 2, 60% of businesses would consider paying a ransomware demand. So that's 3 in 5, or 60% of organizations say they would consider paying an extortion demand in the event of a ransomware attack, according to a new study by the New Star International Security Council. So that's a pretty good chunk.
Right. And ransomware issuers, I guess maybe the term ransomwarers out there. Apparently 1 in 5 businesses would be prepared to spend 20% or more of their annual revenue to restore systems. So if you're looking for your next ransom amount, about 20% of revenue for that year.
You think it's ransomwareites or ransomwarians? Or
ransomwarians.
All sorts of possibilities.
Right.
There.
So in regards to that stat, 1 in 5 businesses be prepared to spend 20% of their annual revenue to restore their systems. I have to wonder what the follow-up question response would be if you asked which companies would be willing to spend 10% to prevent ransomware.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that seems like it would be a little more ideal, and then you would know how much you're spending. But
right.
As we did say earlier in our interview segment with Aaron, the philosophy now is to be prepared to respond more than necessarily completely prevent. Yeah.
Right.
So the recent spate of incidents, including the JBS meat hack, which led to meat hack. He's just like hacking up some meat. Led to a reported $11 million payment, and the Colonial Pipeline attack, which involved a $4.4 million ransom, much of which, as you may have heard, was recovered by the FBI. But those two in particular have reignited the debate on whether it is ever right for organizations to pay a ransom demand. We actually had that $11 million JBS meat ransom report come through the day after we recorded our last episode. So we knew it all along. We just couldn't tell you.
Right. We'll give you a update next week if they recover some of that $11 million, though. So keep an eye out for that. New Star's study was based on a survey of 304 senior professionals across 6 markets in the United States and Europe, and it found that 80% of respondents emphasized defending against attacks in light of current events. So this is definitely on everybody's radar. It sounds like this is no longer a little niche issue. Pretty much every executive out there has this on their mind.
Yeah, and we are approaching 50 episodes in about 2 years of doing this podcast. And even just from the time that we've done this podcast, I know early on we had a headline that was talking about cybersecurity not being a super high priority for businesses, and that has changed quite a bit.
You just got to hack some meat, and suddenly it's important again.
Yeah. So more than 2/3, 69%, in fact, saw ransomware as a growing threat to their organization, and that made it the top concern across more than a dozen attack vectors.
Right, so participants were also asked whether they thought that the currently available cybersecurity technologies on the market are sufficient to protect against ransomware. About 74% believed that they are very or somewhat sufficient, while 26% viewed the technologies as somewhat or very insufficient. So pretty one-sided, but maybe more realistic on the other side.
Yeah, it's interesting, and again, we don't have the full meat of the survey. So there are definitely some follow-up questions that I would be interested in, but 3/4 saying that they're pretty satisfied with what's out there to protect against ransomware is good. Are those 3/4 of how many people out of this group that are actually using them is another question. And then
right.
The 26% who didn't like them as much, again, I'm curious if the 304 people are all using something and it's some of them don't like it and some of them do, or
does that 26% have no protection because they don't believe in any of this stuff? I don't know.
Or 26% think their non-protection is insufficient or something. I don't know. Yeah, so the chairman of the New Star Group, Rodney Jaffe, said companies must unite in not paying ransoms. Attackers will continue to increase their demands for ever larger ransom amounts, especially if they see that companies are willing to pay. This spiral upwards must be stopped. The better alternative is to invest proactively in mitigation strategies before the attacks. So he definitely has staked his position on the subject, but as we see in some of these real world situations lately, a lot of companies are just like, all right, you got me.
Yeah. Seems like we're sending a bit of mixed messages here between the idea of prevention and just assuming you'll always be attacked. So it seems like the calculus is shifting back and forth, and one calculus that hasn't shifted much, at least from the perspective of experts, is whether or not you should pay these ransoms. All the experts out there are saying don't do it. It's going to encourage more ransomware. So they've been pretty strong and consistent in that message, at least.
Yeah, they have, and it just seems to come down to, it's nice to say that, but a lot of these companies, when faced with a situation like the meat supplier, the Colonial Pipeline folks, they just want to get back to business as soon as they possibly can, even if the ransom may not pan out in quite the same way as they're expecting it to. I mean, we talked about the Colonial ransom payment didn't even really net them anything. They ended up solving the problem themselves internally, but they just want to take whatever action they can to get back online and doing what they do. So a lot of times I think leadership at these companies is just ready to write the check and move forward.
Yeah, hit the reset button and keep going. Be interesting to see how this question was answered 5 years ago and how it'll be answered 5 years from now. Mm-hmm. We're sitting at 60% saying that they're willing to pay the ransom. So whether that will go up or down, depending on the headlines over the next few years, will remain to be seen.
Yeah, and I would bet, even less than 5 years ago, I'd say a year or two ago, we hadn't seen this persistent amount of ransomware news happening where all of these companies were being attacked. I wouldn't be surprised if you did this a year and a half ago if 60% said no way, or maybe 80% said
all
no
feeling
way.
A little big in their britches because they haven't really seen the extent of it yet.
But now everybody everywhere is seeing that they could be targeted, and so they're being a little more realistic and saying, if we got hit, we might actually just go ahead and pay the ransom.
Right, and maybe the other two of these five would have a different answer if they were in a real-life attack. So we'll find out.
Now, headline at number 3. North Korea exploited VPN flaw to hack South's Nuclear Research Institute. So South Korea's state-run Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute disclosed that its internal network was infiltrated by suspected attackers operating out of its northern counterpart. The intrusion is said to have taken place on May 14th through a vulnerability in an unnamed VPN vendor.
Right. This involved a total of 13 IP addresses, one of which was previously linked to a state-sponsored threat actor out of North Korea named Kimsuki, I believe is the pronunciation.
I think so. Yeah, that sounds right. So the institute was established in 1959, and it is in the city of Daejeon. It's a government-funded research institute that designs and develops nuclear technologies related to reactors, fuel rods, radiation fusion, and nuclear safety. But anytime you see the word nuclear and hack, those are not things that you really like to hear go together.
No, you definitely want to keep all of those systems running. So following the intrusion, the think tank said it took steps to not only block those IP addresses in question, but also the VPN solution that was vulnerable in the first place. Again, unnamed, but we know if you've kept an eye on the news the last month or so that quite a few different VPN solutions have been discovering potential 0 days sort of lurking in the wings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it is interesting, though, that they mentioned that they applied necessary security patches to the VPN solution after the fact. So if the patches are there to apply, you wonder if they might have been able to have applied them before they were breached. But we shall see. At any rate, the Atomic Energy Research Institute, it says it's investigating the subject of the hacking and the amount of damage in a statement. So that doesn't tell you a whole lot of information.
Right. They initially attributed this to a mistake in the response of a working level staff, so definitely sounds like they trying to pass the buck quickly on that one and move on with their lives, so they don't particularly want to talk about. This particular threat has been active since 2012. Mr. Kimsuki, I imagine that's actually a whole cell full of people, not just one. But they also have some nicknames: Thallium, Black Banshee, and my personal favorite, Velvet Cholima.
Yeah, I don't know what some of those words are, but
they're pretty well known for attacking different types of think tanks and nuclear power operators in South Korea, as well as other neighboring Asian countries. So this is sort of on message for this particular group. Nothing new in that arena.
As long as they're not emptying the tank full of think, then, we're good to go. But earlier in June, cybersecurity firm Malwarebytes disclosed a wave of attacks undertaken by Kim Soo-gi to strike high-profile government officials in the country. And they've done it by installing an Android and Windows backdoor called Appleseed for amassing valuable information. I feel like we talked about Appleseed before at some point, too.
I believe so, yeah. So targeted entities in the past have involved the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, ambassadors from Sri Lanka, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency officers and a deputy consul general at the Korean Consulate General in Hong Kong. So pretty wide splattering of targets, a lot of high-level officials, and again, focused on this nuclear sector.
Yeah, and going back to the how here with Appleseed talking about and Kim Soo-gi, interesting to note that it is Android and Windows being exploited. So we're talking not just, your typical computer network, but if Android's getting involved, then it's got to be some type of mobile device, unless everyone's got Chromebooks or something.
Yeah, I would assume this has something to do with apps rather than any email or phishing attempts would be my guess.
Yeah, so if they're going after high-profile government officials and you got Android on there, then they're obviously getting into their phones somehow. So that'll be interesting.
And just to be clear, this particular think tank sort of focuses on the aspects of nuclear power that have to deal with power generation and not so much nuclear weaponry, if anybody out there was worried about that.
Yeah, much less to worry about when it's just nuclear power.
Yeah, just a smaller of the two.
But yeah, we just wanted to bring this one up because we've been talking a lot about Russia, but there are some other places that have some cybercrime happening. And with the North Korean side of things, most of the time we are talking state-sponsored there, where I don't know if there's too many lines being
non-sponsored. Yeah. Well, yeah.
But so stay tuned to this, but hopefully they've moved on and are okay to go now. Thanks for listening to this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. And thanks very much to Aaron Chen and Shane Davis with Sophos for joining us. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now, however you listen, to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode, but in the meantime, we remind you to
get secure, stay secure.